Very fancy, isn't it?
It is.
All right. Welcome to Introduction to the New Testament. I'm Robert Miles. I'm the Senior Lecturer here at Wollaston Theological College, Senior Lecturer in New Testament. In fact, have only been here in a full-time capacity since July. Prior to that, I was a lecturer in the Theological Studies program at Murdoch University. And then prior to that, I moved to Perth in 2017. Prior to that, I was at the University of Auckland, which is where I'm from originally. You might occasionally detect a bit of the accent. I try to hide it as much as I can. So I'm interested in getting to know your names and what's brought you to this unit before we begin. So and hopefully learning names as well. So perhaps if we start down here and go around.
My name is Eddie Brooks, and I'm doing this course because I just want to increase my faith, my belief in Christianity. That's basically where I am with it.
And you've done other units in the certificate?
Yes, I have done. Oh, they've only got 2 left after this one.
Oh, great. Yeah. Thanks, Eddie.
I'm John. Like Eddie, doing this to improve my knowledge theologically. And, well, I had to complete the course. This is my last of the required subjects, and then one more of the electives to go. Not sure where it will take me, but I think it's all just a starting point, and then you can explore further.
That's great. Thanks.
My name's Anna, and I've got 2 more subjects to do. And I'm here because I'm interested in Christianity.
Good.
I'm Roger. I've done 1 elective and 1 core unit. This is my third unit. It's just the next one that's on offer. I became very frustrated in the Bible studies in my local parish council, because the parish church, because without an ordained person present or a learned person present, it's hard to dig past just the surface. You need some help to know how to dig down. And so I'm hoping to improve that level of knowledge.
Thanks, Roger.
My name is Karen. This is my last unit. I started the course to sort of see if I could sort of answer some of the questions I had about Christianity, but I must admit, I think I've got more questions. And the more I learn, the more I realise how little I know and how there's so much more to learn. But it's been interesting because I sort of found areas that I think I'd like to sort of follow along. So yeah, it's really great eye-opener.
Thanks, Karen.
My name's Anne, and this is my second core unit. I came to this because I've been discussing with my rector the possibility of my perhaps doing more. And we were talking about the possibility of my being an LPM. And he said, well, if you're going to do that, you really need a little bit of a better theoretical background to give you credibility. So still don't quite know where I'm going with this, but when we saw the Old Testament was the first unit, we thought, well, I might as well enroll in it and then just sort of see where everything takes me. So I'm not quite sure where I'm going, but I think it'll unfold as I go.
Thanks, Anne.
My name's Glenda. I'm interested in the history of Christianity, and now that I've retired, I've got a little bit more time on my hands, and I've been able to sort of delve into this purely out of interest. So yeah, I'm not sure where I'm going either, but I'm enjoying it.
Thanks, Linda.
My name's Claire. I'm a retired nurse and midwife. This is my second core unit. I'm thinking I'd like to become a school chaplain, but I've always had an interest in Christianity, and I'm doing Bible studies as well at the moment. And yeah, I am thoroughly enjoying it as well, and it's always been part of my life. And this is the first time I've actually had an opportunity to actually delve a bit deeper and read up and enjoy the discussions that we've been having.
That's great. Thanks, Claire. All right. Well, I think I can learn the names pretty quickly. Yeah, it's sort of confusing that we've got Anna and Anne kind of parallel, but I'm trying not to confuse. Where did you? I heard this from some of you, but where did you find out about the certificate or the units specifically?
Through the rector and then through the website.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that the same for everyone?
My rector put me on to it.
Yeah, sorry,
Our rector put us.
Oh yeah, yeah, okay.
Yes.
And my son's school, he's at Hale, so.
Oh yes, yeah,
It's the newsletter really for me.
yeah. Okay, that's great. It's good to know because we have no idea like how sort of word gets out there, because we don't really advertise it heavily except through various channels through the diocese. Are you from the same churches, or do
No.
all come from different? Yeah, that's great. That's really awesome. All right. Well, let's go just through a bit of admin stuff to start with. So obviously, I mentioned that there's been some issues with the textbook. I ordered a couple of copies in advance, not knowing that we'd have as many students as we do, and because there's also several students online, about 4 or 5. So yeah, there's a bit of a shortage of textbooks. So who doesn't have a textbook presently? Okay.
I'm supported.
And
They get to the end of calls.
so I had a look through various libraries, and there is a copy at the Murdoch University Library. And you may not know this, but as students enrolled in a course at Wollaston Theological College, you can get free membership at Murdoch University Library, which I actually highly recommend if you're interested in doing any further reading related to any of these units, because that's where our main theological collection is held. So there is a copy there, and there are 2 copies in like the WA community state libraries or whatever. I've never actually borrowed a book from any of those, so I don't quite know how that works, if you can, get them to send it to a different library or something. But so that 3 of you don't rush to Murdoch, does somebody want to go to Murdoch? And
Well, I live quite close to Murdoch, if you don't.
So that,
Do it through
Yeah.
community libraries.
yeah, so that might be the way to go. If you go for the Murdoch one, and I have a bunch of these letters. So basically, you need to prove your enrollment here. I don't know if I have enough for everyone, but basically, if you show them, actually I might, if you show them this letter at the front desk, they should give you a free membership. But of course, if there are any issues, please let me know, and we will try and figure that out. I'll just give one to everyone. Because, through the unit as well, I might make reference to other books that you might be interested in following up on or whatever. And if anybody watching online wants to take up this offer, they can get in touch with me. So the other thing that you'll need, the other book that you'll need is a Bible.
Yeah.
You need to bring a Bible every week. I use the NRSV, and for like university courses, that's what we would prefer. This isn't a university course, it's an evening certificate unit. Any English Bible is fine, any of the major translations. And sometimes it's quite interesting if students have different translations, so we can compare. The NRSV that we use, that I tend to use, is quite a literal translation. Other translations, some are quite literal, others can be more paraphrasing to try and make sense of the text, but I find that can almost over-interpret the text. Sometimes it's good to have a difficult text that you've got to really read 5 times to try and make sense of what it's saying, at least when you're doing the kind of study that we're going to be doing. Other readings, and including the first few chapters of the textbook by Moxon's, are available through Moodle. And everyone here should have access to Moodle.
Yes.
I don't know if everybody has access to it, but you should have access, and you'll be able to find the readings. The unit outline was up there, which I highly recommend reading if you haven't done so already. That's where I would prefer you uploaded your assessments as well. So there's instructions on how to do that on the Moodle website. Those of you who are doing this unit for credit, there's a small assessment exercise, which is basically to keep a reading journal of the required readings, excluding the biblical texts. So there's not that, I actually took a lot of the readings out from how much I used to have in this unit. Basically, there's 1 or 2 compulsory readings, which I would recommend that you did before the lecture or the seminar. And often there's a biblical book or something that would be good to read in its entirety. So say, the Gospel of Mark or something, to read it in its entirety at some time during the week before we have the corresponding lesson. Sometimes there's some additional readings, and I've also got a small bibliography of other texts or whatever that you might find interesting if you want to go further, if you want to explore topics in more detail. This one is there, highly recommended, the New Testament by Bart Ehrman. So this is actually the textbook that I would use if I was teaching this, or when I have taught this class as a 12-week, full-on university course. Very detailed, but very accessible and interesting, and lots of nice color pictures and so on. So that's great. That is quite an expensive book, but there are multiple copies available in the Murdoch University Library, which you all have free access to. So that's an option. There's a couple of other texts there as well, and some online resources. When it comes to online resources, I know this may sound obvious, but it does need to be said. The stuff you find online tends to be of fairly poor quality, especially when it comes to religion, where a lot of people have a vested interest, or coming at it from a whole host of different perspectives, mostly not academic perspectives, which is the kind of approach that we're taking in this unit. So I've got a couple of useful websites there which you can explore topics and so on. And these particular websites are maintained by professional biblical scholars. So that the material that you're getting there is fairly trustworthy and rigorous and so on. I think that's all the admin. Are there any questions at this point?
With the submit time, summaries to you.
Mhm.
Are you wanting us to reference? Because the lecturers don't particularly worry about referencing.
No, you don't need to reference.
We don't need to put reference there.
I'm not sure if I say that or not. If I do say you need to reference, then you do, but I don't think I do. So, I mean, the bar for the assessment is quite low because, you know, this isn't a university course or anything like that. And so I'm not even really asking you to, you know, critically engage with these readings or anything like that. It's simply just to summarize them in no more than 300 words. If you end up handing in far more than that, I won't mark it because it ends up taking up all my time to, you know, so just a brief summary of the main ideas of each of the required readings.
Sorry, your
pretty straightforward.
point 5 does say in
Properly referenced.
referenced.
Yep.
Yeah.
I need to find what properly referenced means, but I guess what I mean by that is that if you have any quotes, make sure they're in quote marks and maybe the page number in brackets. Make sure you clearly identify which reading you're talking about, that kind of thing.
Okay, so we don't have to do.
I don't need
Chicago
extensive
or
bibliography or anything like that. If you want to do that, go for it.
Yeah.
But it's not required.
Okay.
Thanks for spotting that. Any other questions? All right. So this first lecture is going to be quite a bit of me talking, at least for the first part. I'm going to orient you to the kind of approach that we're going to be taking in this unit. And I'm going to do that by actually honing in on just one biblical verse, kind of taking you in detail into one particular verse to give you a kind of crash course on the kind of approach that we're going to take. But I'm going to say a whole bunch of things that will apply more broadly to the kinds of things that we're going to learn and the kinds of questions that we're going to ask in this unit. And then, so this first bit it'll take us until a break or something after an hour or so. And then the second part will be a bit more interactive. My style tends to be a bit of a mix of me talking and questions, discussion, and sometimes activities or you know, breaking off into pairs or whatever and looking at a text or whatever. So that's how most of the unit will run. So what you're going to get now isn't what it's going to be like necessarily for the whole eight weeks. But I will try to keep your attention. I think I can manage that. So what I'm going to do is say some things about the historical background and the wider political context of the New Testament world. And building on this, we'll come back to unpacking this one verse from the New Testament. The verse is from the very first chapter and verse of the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark, as we'll see in coming weeks, is thought to be the earliest gospel, the first gospel that was written. And the verse reads, "The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Now, this is a verse that perhaps on first reading probably comes across today as quite innocuous. But there are a few central claims being made about Jesus and by the early Jesus movement that are packed in here. This is about the good news or gospel of someone called Jesus Christ, who happens to also be the Son of God. I want us to hear Mark 1 verse 1 with the punch that it intends for us to feel. And my hope is that by the end of this part of the lecture, you'll be left with some intrigue as to just how valuable an historical approach to engaging the New Testament writings can be. And that is the approach that we'll be taking in this unit, a historical one. Okay, so imagine the following scenario. In 2,000 years, in the distant future, you're an archaeologist sifting through the ruins of a landmass previously known as the United States of America, a region now uninhabited for several centuries following a devastating war on the continent. All memory of the United States as we know it today has largely faded from popular consciousness. One day, you, the archaeologist, 2,000 years in the future, discovers beneath some rubble an artifact. It's well preserved, which is remarkable given its cheap construction. The object is a bright, fiery red, and written on the front of it is a phrase embroidered in an ancient script known as American English. You take the artifact to someone who knows how to decipher this dead language and discover that it translates as follows in capital letters: "Make America great again." And the expert also tells you that this object was known as a hat or a cap, and many similar objects have been found in the region. Now, you try to make sense of these words, "Make America great again," by recognizing the plain meaning of the phrase. It's quite hard to do if you're not from our world, right? You suppose it might evoke something of the declining late American empire, but it could also just be a random slogan printed on a hat, like so many of the other hats found of a similar design, Nike, whatever, you know, that have been discovered in the area. You don't really think at all to associate the hat with the Republican Party or Donald Trump or Trumpism. Why would you? From the hat itself, if you don't have the context, there's no obvious reason why you would make those associations. And the hat itself also doesn't say anything explicitly about building a wall, keeping migrants out, and so on. And the way in which this hat may provoke a reaction, perhaps a visceral reaction for some people, is also lost on you. All the emotive baggage that comes with this artifact, you don't get it from the hat itself. So the question is, can you ever truly understand this artifact without having a fuller appreciation for its historical context? And this is really a basic but fundamental point about language. And also something that the academic discipline of biblical studies and New Testament studies rests upon. A text, any text, whether a biblical text or a simple slogan on a hat, needs to be put in its full context in order to make sense of it, in order for it to be understood. So let's now travel back in the other direction, back to the first century of the Common Era, to the events surrounding Jesus and the rise of the early Jesus movement, birth of Christianity. In order to understand the New Testament, we need to understand a few things about its world. And what I'm going to tell you, what I'm going to paint, is a bit of a larger than life story, but it in fact leads us right into Mark 1, verse 1. And we have to start somewhere, so we start here. What is the original language of the New Testament? It's on the slide. As some of you will know, the New Testament was originally written in a form of ancient Greek, known as Koine Greek. koine means common. And it refers to the common language or a common language that was spoken around much of the ancient European and Mediterranean world during the 1st century. All 27 books of the New Testament are written in this language. But this raises an important question. Why is the New Testament written in Greek? Why is it not written in Hebrew, the language of ancient Israel and of the Old Testament? Or even in Aramaic? Aramaic was the language spoken by Jesus and his first disciples. Well, a few hundred years prior to the 1st century, Alexander the Great, as many of us will have heard of this great figure of the past before, the Macedonian king and one of history's most revered military minds, spread Greek culture throughout the Mediterranean world via conquest. And in expanding Greek culture, he established the largest empire the world had ever seen to that point. And as part of the Greek culture that Alexander spread along with his conquests, he took a common language, Greek, which would later become the language of the New Testament. So the Greek language was spread far and wide, and it was usually spoken alongside local languages and dialects among subject populations of this empire. But interestingly, Alexander himself died young at just 32 years old, and his expansive empire was subsequently divided up among his generals. And for a few hundred years, there were ongoing battles between these generals and their successors, between these territories. So although they shared this common culture, this common language of Greek, they were divided. And it's within this world of political upheavals, war, instability, and so on, that the city-state of Rome begins to flex its muscles. Rome begins to spread its political and economic influence, gaining regional dominance first over the Italian peninsula by the end of the 3rd century BCE, and then over the rest of much of the rest of the Western Mediterranean over the next 100 years or so. And part of Rome's success in terms of their own expanse was that they were able to, or they did utilize the aspects of Greek culture that had spread before it. So although their official language was Latin, the language that business was conducted in and so on was Greek. That was kept in place. If you've ever looked at the pantheon of Roman gods and Greek gods, most of them are the same, just with different names. So much of Greek culture was just simply adapted or transposed into this Roman paradigm. Now, Rome's ambitions, or one of Rome's ambitions, was to try to unify the known world under a single family or household of Rome. And you can see on the slide here an ancient Roman coin. And I'm going to show a number of material artifacts to flesh out the context and the points that I'm trying to make. And you see on this coin, this Roman coin, a simple yet powerful image of two clasped hands, a handshake symbolizing peace and harmony. Rome was inundated with coins such as these, part of a larger effort to promulgate what was known as the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana, P-A-X-R-O-M-A-N-A, towards a more prosperous empire. The Pax Romana was Latin and can be translated as Roman peace, the Roman peace. So the Romans, literally understood themselves as going around and spreading the Roman peace among the world, spreading peace to the nations. By the 1st century, Rome was widely credited as uniting the different Greek factions of the ancient Mediterranean, which had been warring and so on, and inaugurating a period of peace and stability. If you have the textbook, there's also a map one of the first few pages, so you can have a look at that as well if this is a bit too small to see the details. But the point of showing this map is actually just to illustrate the expanse of the Roman Empire by the mid-1st century. And in fact, the Roman Empire would expand further beyond this, but by the time of Jesus and Paul and the earliest Christians, this was a huge political force.
Can I just say something?
Mm-hmm.
They were trying to spread peace and stability and uniting everybody, and yet there were such violent warmongers.
I'm getting there.
Sorry.
But it's true, and the idea of spreading peace, that's part of their propaganda. So of course you see it on their coins. And soon enough we'll see the inverse of this, the opposite of this. So on this map you can see by the mid-1st century the empire spreading up into Britannia, up in the northwest, right down to Syria, Palestine in the east. Now, crucially, after the spread of Roman rule, Palestine, Judea, and Galilee. Again, if you look at, that's not the map you want to look at. On page 5 of the textbook, there's a map just of Palestine, and that gives you a sense of Judea in relation to Galilee. So Galilee in the north, the area in the north, Judea in the south. Judea is where the capital city Jerusalem is located. Nazareth is in Galilee. Most of Jesus' ministry, Capernaum and so on, all those places. Sea of Galilee, it all happens up there in the north. We'll come back to that kind of stuff in the future, but that's just so you know that you've got some maps there to look at. I've also actually, I should mention, on Moodle, uploaded a document with some high quality maps. So you might want to print those out, and often if you've got a good Bible, you'll have maps at the back there and stuff. I find it very helpful to visualize where things are happening when place names are mentioned, especially when we're not absolutely familiar with the geography. Okay, so after the spread of Roman rule, Palestine, including Judea, Galilee, the homeland of Jesus and his first followers, was now under Roman rule. And it's really important to stress that Jesus himself was Jewish. He was not Christian or Roman. He was a faithful Jew who worshipped the God of Israel, saw himself as obedient to the law of Moses, and who is best understood as completely situated within the Jewish tradition. He was not attempting to start a new religion called Christianity or anything like that. Of course, that did eventually happen, but that was a process that took a long time to come about. In his day, he was completely within Judaism. So here we go to the inverse, the flip side of the Pax Romana. While Roman propaganda proclaimed that it brought the Roman peace to the world. What did it actually mean? What did this actually mean for its colonies at the margin? What did it entail for ordinary people living in somewhere like Galilee, Judea, or Britannia? Well, have a close look at this Roman relief and think about what you see depicted. What's going on here? Does anyone want to describe it for us?
It's like the Roman guy is eating the first meal.
He's not eating, but he's definitely.
No, it's eating.
It's not hitting. Yeah, hitting. I thought you said eating. Right? No, yes.
It's actually a female,
It's like-
so maybe he's going to go do worse.
I mean, this is a pretty blatant depiction of gendered violence, isn't it? Yeah. And a man, stands over a woman, holding her down with his clenched fist, raised fist, with his knee, subduing her, overpowering her. It's pretty disturbing. It's a very violent, graphic image of patriarchal dominance. And we actually know precisely what this image depicts because there's an inscription down the bottom. And the inscription reads, "The Emperor Claudius," that's the Roman emperor, "subjugates Britannia," personified as a woman. So the woman being suppressed is not just a random woman. It's in fact meant to personify a gendered personification of the nation, the subject peoples of Britannia, who the Romans, in particular Emperor Claudius, have brought under Roman control.
So the violence starts from the top.
The violence starts from the top, and the violence was understood in explicitly gendered terms, which is quite interesting. These images are for public display.
Sorry to disturb you.
No.
So I'm just thinking, so if they found that someone did not abuse his wife or a lady, was he soft? Was he regarded soft within the Roman Empire?
Well, I don't want to go too far down a different path, but
because I mean,
the Romans had a particular understanding of masculinity and femininity, and it was very much tied up with the man being assertive and dominant and so on, and the woman being passive. And it's difficult to generalize because it's not always the case in every place, but generally speaking, that these are the sorts of images that you see reflected in the ideology of that world. So inscribed in Roman imperial artwork, these sorts of things, planted in public spaces around, all around the empire, is a somewhat malevolent idea that powerful and mighty, perhaps manly Rome has succeeded in subduing the nations. Now, as I mentioned previously, the Jewish nation, the Jewish peoples, like Britannia, were also under Roman control. And after a series of violent uprisings and a protracted war during the first century, Judea was aggressively put back in its place by Rome as a defeated, conquered nation. During this war, Jerusalem, the holy city, was ransacked, and even the Jewish temple was destroyed, obliterated. And this took place in 70 CE. Now, you may be thinking, okay, but this was several decades after the life of Jesus, and that's true. But in fact, scholars think that our Gospels were written starting from about 70. In fact, most scholars would date the Gospel of Mark, as we'll see, around the time of this Jewish war. And of course, you know, if we think of contemporary examples of, or historic examples of nations that, you know, are under control of a foreign empire or what have you, it's not as if it's peaceful and then suddenly there's a violent clash, right? The build-up to what eventuated in a revolt starting in 66 CE would presumably have been going on for decades beforehand.
Can I just ask a question here? If Mark was supposedly has written this gospel in 70 CE, how old would he have been when Jesus was alive? And how old was he when he wrote it, or was it another scribe that wrote it?
We will come to answer that question. It's a good question, and the questions of authorship, dating, kind of found of each of the biblical books are some of the fundamental questions that we will discuss through. So I won't give you the answer now, but it's definitely a good question. Okay, where was I? Yes. So during this war, the temple is destroyed, and the Roman emperor at the time issues a series of commemorative coins to celebrate his victory over Judea, perhaps also to crush any lingering good spirits among this rebellious nation. And I've got an example of one of the coins on the slide. The reverse of the coin depicts, again, a female figure, this time bound and seated, representing an attitude of mourning. It's hard to make out, but the figure standing behind her, I'm not entirely sure about this. I think it might be a Jewish man with his hands bound behind his back. I'm not actually 100% sure of that. But what you can see around the edge of the coin, the capital letters, it reads Judea capta, which means Judea conquered. And on the front side of the coin is, of course, the emperor, the Roman emperor himself, looking rather pleased with all his accomplishments. So again, once again, like with the relief of the Emperor Claudius subjugating Britannia, Roman imperial artifacts like coins, inscriptions, statues, and so on, these are all in distribution, functioning as propaganda, reinforcing Rome's superiority and right to rule. Everyone should know the Romans are in charge. It's minted on the coins, embedded basically everywhere through popular culture. And not only this, if you begin to resist the emperor's tight reign, there is a very real threat that you'll have legions of Roman soldiers rolling down the nearest Roman road to your location, ready to aggressively reassert Roman control. We know this because this is exactly what happened, not just in Judea, but in many places. One method that proved particularly effective in Rome, asserting its control over its subject people, was through the use of what we might name state-sanctioned terror, specifically the use of crucifixion. And while crucifixion was used by many societies, or a few societies, not many, before the Romans, including the Persians and the Macedonians, under Roman rule, crucifixion became widespread and notorious, in some cases involving mass deaths. Crucifixion was public and intended to serve as a spectacle, an example to others, particularly subject peoples, that they needed to respect and obey Roman rule. It was gruesome. It tended to be reserved for slaves, traitors and perceived enemies, dissidents of Rome. Roman citizens were typically exempt. So in addition to all this, we've got the use of propaganda, kind of the soft power that reinforces this ideology of Roman superiority, Roman rule, and of course the military violence that undergirds it, the hard power. Rome also developed its own theology to undergird its political objectives. And a number of New Testament scholars call this Roman imperial theology. One of the readings for this lecture was by a scholar called Warren Carter, and that's exactly what he calls it, Roman imperial theology. The modern day distinction between religion and politics is exactly that, a modern distinction. Prior to the rise of modernity, there was no clear-cut distinction between church and state, religion and politics. And the world we encounter in the New Testament, we have, you know, through this course, I will remind you time and again that we can't look at the New Testament reductively as simply being about religious matters. To do so would be an anachronism. It would go against how the text would have been understood in its own historical context, when politics and religion were sometimes indistinguishable, but definitely intermingled and very often indistinguishable. So the world we encounter in the New Testament is one in which people would have quite readily overlaid the political with theological significance. So the birth of an heir to the emperor is, we will get there, but was widely proclaimed as gospel, as good news through the empire. So you have a theological vocabulary being used to proclaim and propagate those sorts of high political events. And the theological was also readily understood as political. Religion was not a private matter of the individual heart, but rather it concerned all of life. It was overtly public, and it really operated completely separated from the political sphere. And I think those of you who have done the Old Testament unit, you'll be able to appreciate this with respect to the Old Testament, that these literatures and stories and so on, that they concern a nation and a nation's relationship to God and the rest of the world. And often the issues that they are facing have to do with foreign empires and navigating, you know, a political as well as a theological world, or navigating a political world that's understood in theological terms, or understanding theological terms in political. So these things go hand in hand, and we would do well to remember that. Within Roman imperial theology, Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, was widely proclaimed as God's agent on earth, the bringer of peace, the Pax Romana, the bringer of the gospel, the good news. So gospel simply means good news. Lord, Saviour, the Son of God, he was even thought to have been born of miraculous circumstances. I could go on. As God's agent on earth, as Caesar was believed to be God's agent on earth, it was self-evident that the Roman gods willed Rome to rule. And the Roman gods, common sense would dictate within this framework, were more powerful than other gods, like Britannia's god or Judea's god. And this was known to be self-evident because Rome ruled. Political power went hand in hand with divine power. The gods direct history, and look at the world as it is. Rome's might cannot be surpassed.
Can I just ask something? Sorry to
No,
interrupt.
please go ahead.
You've got gods as in one god, but the Romans had plenty
They
of
do.
gods.
So he was understood as God's agent. I mean, I've got some evidence of this in the next slide, but specifically Jupiter's agent on Earth.
Can I just ask something? Something else? You said about the crucifixions, they were, you know, rescues. What about throwing them to the lions and things like that?
Yeah, so that would happen in the arena or the Colosseum or whatever, but that tended to be for entertainment. But no, there are the sorts of these ideas that later on Christians were thrown to the lions for sport or whatever, for punishment. We will come to that later in the unit, I think. No, that definitely happened as well. But I mean that tended to happen where you had the infrastructure for like the equivalents of the Colosseum or whatever. So where they didn't have that, on the outposts of Judea, crucifixion would have been the go-to kind of punishment.
Yeah, that film Spartacus, really, that was quite shocking. Like the original film, anyway, just saw the crucifixion.
What is the symbolism of the child in that picture?
Yeah.
It's a cherubim. I'm not quite sure what the significance is. It might simply be an indication of his divine power or something. I'm not 100% sure. But Augustus is often depicted with it. So here's another coin. This is a denarius coin minted in Rome in 17 BCE. And on the left is Caesar Augustus, the emperor we've just been talking about, the son of God, the first Roman emperor of the Roman Empire. And on the right is Julius Caesar, the famous ruler of Rome, who was assassinated in 44 BCE. Now, after his assassination, Julius had named Augustus in his will as his son and heir. He was adopted son, which opened the way for Augustus to eventually become the first emperor of Rome. And in the aftermath of his assassination, Julius Caesar was deified by the Roman Senate. He himself became a god. So, interestingly, in this coin, the connection of Augustus as son of God is to his father, or being the heir of his father, Julius Caesar, who was divinized by the Roman Senate. In the days after his death, a comet was seen in the sky, and this was seen as proof of Julius Caesar's divinity. And you can see on the coin on the right, that's meant to be a comet above his head, symbolizing that. So that's kind of how you can tell what's going on there. So the coin, you'll see it says on the left, Divi F. This stands for Divi Filius, son of God. It's Latin, so it's not the exact same wording as you might find in Greek, but anybody in the first century would make an approximation of when the New Testament calls Jesus son of God. These are the kinds of associations that would be being made. So I've introduced you to some of the basic outlines of Roman imperial theology and propaganda. And if you want to look at that in more detail as well, you should read the chapter, if you haven't done so already, by Warren Carter. And if you're interested in following up, the whole book is quite interesting. So let's return back to Mark 1, verse 1, and unpack it. within its original historical context. And you're probably already, making associations and thinking of the possibilities and thinking, oh, wow, this probably means a lot more than I initially thought, or there might be a lot more going on here than initially meets the eye to the modern reader. Most scholars think that Mark was the first of our 4 Gospels to be written, as I mentioned, around 70 CE. And the Gospel of Mark is also traditionally associated with Rome. It's been suggested that this is where this Gospel may have been composed. I don't really know how conclusively we can hold to this tradition. Often we have traditions, as we'll see, similar traditions emerge around the authorship of these texts. So Mark originally was anonymous. Our earliest manuscripts of Mark are not ascribed to anyone, and most scholars would treat Mark as anonymous to partially answer your question. Later traditions certainly came to ascribe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but this is a point that we will come back to in subsequent weeks. But, the tradition that associates Mark with Rome is, I think, interesting, at least, in terms of what I'm about to say, and also the dating. The dating of around the time that Judea is being invaded and the revolt is being violently suppressed. The first verse of Mark sets up this gospel as a counter-narrative. A counter-narrative is simply a narrative that goes against another narrative. And in the case of the Roman world, the dominant narrative, the narrative that I've been exploring, is this idea that Rome was divinely justified to rule politically over its subject peoples. So a theological justification for political rule. And this is why I've obviously been showing you artifacts from the ancient world, like coins, statues, reliefs, and giving you a bit of information on Roman imperial theology, which all espouse this dominant narrative. Mark quite often uses the same language, but uses it about Jesus in a way that I would suggest contests Rome's legitimacy, both theologically, but also politically. So let's break down the verse word by word. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The first term, beginning, comes from the Greek word arche, which actually means more than beginning in a chronological sense. It also conveys a sense of authority or preeminence, such as in the English words archangel or archbishop, where this word can be found as a prefix. So arche, beginning, the sense of chronological beginning, but also preeminence. The good news or gospel, as I mentioned previously, this was a term predominantly associated with Caesar. When the emperor's consort gave birth to an heir, this was widely proclaimed as gospel, good news. When the Roman military conquered far-off nations, bringing them into the fold of the empire, this was widely proclaimed as gospel, good news. Of Jesus Christ. Well, Jesus, I haven't spoken much about Jesus in this lecture, which is perhaps surprising, but for the purposes of understanding this passage, I think it's actually enough to simply say that any Jewish reader would immediately recognize this as a Jewish name, or at least the Greek form of a Jewish name, Yeshua or Joshua. And if we were to keep reading through the Gospel of Mark, we would learn he's not exactly your ordinary, typical candidate to be caught up with this kind of exalted language. From the perspective of Rome, at least, Jesus is a nobody, located on the margins of the empire and from an insignificant village. recall that scathing remark in John's Gospel, nothing good comes from Nazareth. Christ. Now this one requires a little more explanation. Christ obviously isn't Jesus' surname, but a title. Jesus wasn't the son of Mary and Joseph Christ. Sometimes that does need explaining for people who don't have the background. But the title Christ in the Greek is equivalent to the title Messiah in the Hebrew. So Christ, Messiah, same thing. It's not a Roman title, unlike many of the other words we've seen on here, but it has everything to do with Rome in this context. The Messiah or the Christ was a Jewish concept used to refer to a kingly figure. The anointed one is what it literally means. And this figure was thought that this figure would bring salvation to the Jewish people. But again, salvation is here not understood in a narrow kind of spiritual sense. It has concrete political implications. In the same way that the God of Israel delivered the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt, the Messiah would deliver and save his people from their own foreign oppressors. So remember, once again, in the ancient world, religion and politics go hand in hand. In the first century, salvation for the Jewish people would have meant not just, the first association of that term would have meant not just a spiritual or heavenly deliverance, but deliverance from really existing worldly forces of evil, from foreign oppressors, from the shackles of empire, war, and terror that constituted daily life for the majority of the population under Rome's control. But again, it's not to say that it wasn't religious. It was that they understood all these concrete human things as being completely infused and wrapped up with spiritual forces. There was no separation as such. Okay, so that's Christ. Finally, Son of God. A title, as we've seen already, widely associated with the Roman emperor. It was part of the imperial theology, which provided divine justification for Caesar's rule. The emperor was Jupiter's agent on earth, divine source of his power and success. So what does all this mean? We have in Mark 1, verse 1, a grand proclamation about a relatively insignificant person using extremely exalted language normally associated with Roman imperial theology in a way that contests Rome's legitimacy. Mark also proclaims Jesus as the Messiah, as do all the New Testament documents. And well, this is all very well and good, except for the fact that he wasn't the legal king. Not within the eyes of the Romans, not within the eyes of the Jewish aristocracy, who collaborated with Roman rule. So when Jesus was sentenced to death, the method used was crucifixion, a Roman method of punishment specifically reserved for traitors, surgeons of the empire. I'm sure if I have another. Okay, that's my last one of these. So the charge of Jesus's crime, is nailed above his head, famously in the Gospels. This is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And the sign is intended as mockery. In today's vernacular, it might read something like, this is John Smith from Bunbury, President of the Universe. It's meant to sound as ridiculous or unhinged as that. And what's more bizarre, though, is that the early followers of Jesus are proclaiming these exalted titles about a man who has been put to death, discredited, defeated by the Roman Empire. In the eyes of Rome, once Jesus had been crucified, that should have been the end of that, should have crushed it. But as we know, the early followers of Jesus believed he had been raised back to life by the Jewish God. And if we once again hold earthly political matters in tension with heavenly spiritual ones, this would mean that Rome's God and Roman power had been defeated or was in the process of being defeated and being overturned by the Jewish God. As a consequence, the earliest followers of Jesus rendered their theological and political allegiance to Jesus and to the Jewish God, who they claim had raised Jesus back to life. And this really is a key point to understanding the New Testament. What unifies these 27 books is the proclamation that Jesus is the Savior of the humankind, that through the death and resurrection of Jesus, God has and is dramatically intervening in the world and is dramatically overturning the world. But what does this really mean? What does this entail? And we can only really begin to unpack some of these things by placing them, I would argue, strongly in their historical context. Once we do this, we discover that, in some sense, the New Testament is propaganda or counter-propaganda. It itself is engaged in a kind of first century theological battle of ideas and beliefs, contesting beliefs with other dominant ideas, beliefs and narratives and powers within its own age and context. So I want to just conclude this part of the lecture and then we'll have a short break, just by reiterating two main points. First, one that I've mentioned many times, but it's worth keeping in mind for the rest of this unit, is that there is no easy distinction between religion and politics. In the first century, religious claims, theological claims, movements and ideas always had political consequences. And the second point flows on from the first, and it's one we can see quite apparent in our unpacking of this one verse, is that the New Testament world is one in which the early followers of Jesus were in constant negotiation with the powers and gods of Rome. This was their ever-present reality, the horizon of their day-to-day lives, and which gave meaning to everything else, including their understanding of Jesus. And while the first verse of Mark may challenge Rome's claims to theological and political superiority, we find that there are other texts in the New Testament that are perhaps more accommodating, and we will explore these in subsequent weeks. So one of the things that we'll discover is that the New Testament, being a collection of writings written by several different authors, does not speak simply with the same voice. There are different perspectives and different positions within these texts. And the way to unpacking that and explaining it and understanding it is to understand these texts as emerging from particular historical, social, and political contexts. So a text like Mark presumably emerges from a context where the author feels quite threatened by the power of Rome and needs to oppose it. Yet we find some other texts, and we will look at some of the other texts in subsequent weeks, where the authors appear to be wanting to build bridges between a Christian identity and a Roman identity. To say, yeah, there's some things that it may look a bit opposed, but ultimately, it's fine. And this, I think, helps to explain ultimately how a few centuries later, Christianity could itself become the religion of the Roman Empire. So if Christianity had, in its inception, been one-dimensionally, anti-Rome and anti-imperial, it would be strange to think it could then succeed as, you know, become so tightly integrated with the Roman Empire itself. So these are the sorts of contradictions and interesting ideas that we will unpack and explore in this unit. All right, so any questions before we stop for a break or comments?
Theology includes spirituality? Or is it
It's a good question. I mean, my understanding of theology would be to take quite a literal definition of it, which is that it's words about God. So you've got theos, logos, logos word, theos God, words about God, discussion about God, talk about God. So we're talking about, for me, theology would be the discourse, the discussion, broadly understood. Do you include spirituality in that? Yes, I would include discussion of spirituality or understandings of spirituality within it. Does that answer your question? It's maybe I'm not sure, but
I'm clear. Well, theology can be about any God or any gods or any God system.
right. So it can be important to say, you know, whether we're talking about Christian theology or Roman imperial theology, or and same with spirituality. Spirituality could be even broader. If you think, you know, a lot of people would claim that they're spiritual but not religious. Or
Yes, that's often the other day.
So it's Christian spirituality.
yeah,
or animism spirituality.
yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Right. Let's pause for. We normally have 10 minutes.
Grab a cup of coffee.
Yep. We'll start back in 10 minutes. Yep.
Give you